1 Corinthians chapter 9, verses 19 through 23. Though I am free and belong to no one, I have made myself a slave to everyone, to win as many as possible. To the Jews I become like a Jew, to win the Jews. To those under the law I become like one under the law, though I myself am not under the law, so as to win those under the law. To those not having the law, I become like one not having the law, though I am not free from God's law, but am under Christ's law, so as to win those not having the law. To the weak I become weak, to win the weak. I have become all things to all people, so that by all possible means I might save some. I do all this for the sake of the gospel, that I may share in its blessings. Paul includes verses 19 through 23 as he moves through his own personal example of chapter 9. So remember that, let me use a different color here. Remember that 9 is Paul's example, and that he's using his example as the right way to utilize Christian freedom and in the giving up of one's rights. So in verses 1 through 18, Paul made the point that he is giving up his right to earning money by preaching the gospel. He has a better reward, which is to preach the gospel for free to everyone. If you can only preach to people who can pay you, you have to only preach in established churches. But Paul, because he can preach to people who can't pay him, can now go in and plant churches. And this ability that Paul has is his boast in the Lord. And we see basically the outworking of that concept here in these verses, in verses 19 through 23. Begins like this. Though I am free, I belong to no one, and I've made myself a slave to everyone, so as to win as many as possible. To win as many as possible. So Paul begins with his own state. Let me change that. I am free. And then he uses this word though, which means he's about to tell us that his freedom is about to be countered here. He is free, and then he kind of doubles down on that, and belong to no one. So free, and here he might be thinking in Christ, and belong to no one. Now this is more like towards people. He is free even in the human sense of the word. And he says, I have made myself a slave to everyone to win as many as possible. So this is where the though comes in. The though is connected to here. So though I am free and belong to no one, this is what I have done. I have, here we go, made myself a slave to everyone. So though I'm free and belong to no one, I have become a slave to everyone. And this piece right here, made myself, means that it was a choice. A free choice. To make himself a slave to everyone. And this is the word slave. And then he gives us the reason. So if we were to ask, over here, why would you give up your freedom? The answer is supplied in the following verses. To win as many as possible. And win, certainly here, means salvation of the lost. And then this statement right here at the beginning, where Paul gives up freedom, is now explained in the following verses 20 through 22. This is the example. And in the example, we get three groups of people. We'll just highlight to show who he's talking about. The Jews, those under the law. I'm supposed to use different colors. I'm sorry. Those under the law. And then the third, four. Those not having the law. And then finally, the weak. the weak. So we get 4 different examples of this. 4 groups that would have different cultural, different behaviors, different norms, that one group would have looked at another group and said, that's unacceptable. And Paul says, yeah, I become like all of them in order to win some of them. So here's the example. We'll get into the first one. To the Jews, I became like a Jew to win the Jews. And this isn't hard for Paul. This is his own cultural context. So these are familiar clothes for Paul to put on. And it's really important. Oh, sorry, we'll go to the next one. To those under the law, I became like one under the law. And those under the law and the Jews would have been most of the time the exact same group of people. If we were to take that Venn diagram, we're looking at, most of that is the same, Jew and under the law. Very rarely you would have some kind of proselyte example over here. So all that to say that the first two, Paul's really talking about the same category of person. To those under the law, which typically is the Jews, though some Gentiles, I became like one under the law. Though, and then we'll get to this in a second. What does this mean? If you are becoming like a Jew, you are living like one under the law. These two are basically describing each other. And what it's speaking to is how you conduct yourself, how you live. So you would have not eaten pork. You would have put 4 tassels on your coat. You would have gone through all of the things that Jews were obligated to do. Observe the Sabbath, of course, all of those things. And it's really important that we understand this statement right here. Though I myself am not under the law. This is super important. Paul does these things knowing that the law has no hold on him. He's died to the law through Christ Jesus. He is not under the law. So he's not doing this to be justified. He's not doing this for salvation. He's not doing this for righteousness. He is doing this. Why? Again, why? And again, he will supply us with the answer. To win those under the law. To win the Jew, Paul will act like, talk like, walk like, eat like a Jew. So he doesn't say, I'm going to make you eat pork before I tell you about Jesus. He says, I'm going to skip pork all the time that I'm with you so that I can tell you about Jesus. We'll worry about getting you out from under the law after you've put your faith in God, but I'm not going to get my priorities reversed. I'm going to become like you freely so that I can win you to Christ. And then you're like, oh, as a Christian, you could kind of see that. Yeah, okay, sure. Well, what about Gentiles? Well, that's what the next example is. Verse 21, the green is about the Gentile. To those not having the law, Gentile, I became like one not having the law. Though, here we go, and Paul's going to say the opposite as he said over here. I am not free from God's law, but am under Christ's law. So that continues over here. This is super important. He says, I'm not free from God's law. Now, the Old Testament law, sure, I'm free from that. But that doesn't mean I'm completely free because I am under Christ's law. So here's what's really important. I became like one not having the law, though I am under Christ's law. That means that Christ's law was the boundary for becoming like one not having the law. So Gentiles can eat pork. Is that against Jesus? Absolutely not. Gentiles also sleep with prostitutes. Does that mean Paul goes to sleep with a prostitute to become like those without having law? No, absolutely. He would never, ever do that because he's still under Christ's law. So as much as possible, he is going to follow Christ and obey Christ's law and then still be like a Gentile. But Christ's law comes first. Right, we see Jesus eat with prostitutes. We see Jesus eat with tax collectors. We see him eat with Gentiles. These are the sorts of things that Jews would not do, hang out with Gentiles. But Paul knows that he's free under Christ's law to do so. And so he does so. Why? Again, we could throw the question down. Why? To win those who do not have the law. This statement, verse 21, would seem to be for most the complete opposite of verse 20. And yet, the principle that guides them is the same. Paul is able to do this because He's been set free from the old law, now follows Christ's law, and he's living that out. Christ's law provides this added flexibility culturally to morph and to talk to more people because you're still loving them. You're still not going to sin against the Lord, but you're free with regard to what you wear and what you eat and how you talk and what day of the week you practice the Sabbath, so that you can reach those not having the law. And then we get to the fourth example down here. To the weak, I become weak to win the weak. Now, what's really interesting about this is that the weak, all throughout 1 Corinthians 8 and 9, has been a reference to believers. So when Paul says, to the weak, I become weak to win the weak, it's very confusing because you would think that they're already saved. So why would he say that he's trying to win the weak? And I think what we're looking at here is a rhetorical device. Paul's copying the formula that he used in verse 20 and in verse 21, down here in verse 22, and he's now bridging the concept. You don't exercise your freedom towards the weak so that you can do what you want. Towards the weak, you become like them so that you can win them. If we were to put this into kind of the terms of 1 Corinthians 8, it would be like, to the weak, I become weak so I can strengthen the weak. So if the weak brother can't eat food sacrificed to idols, I'm not going to eat food sacrificed to idols because that relationship I have with them is going to give me the opportunity to strengthen that person. I think Paul does mean, in this case, when he says, to the weak, I become weak to win the weak, he's talking about the one who, as a new believer, will be weak. You know, if we were to take, somebody who grew up in a very Christian home, was taught right doctrine, and one day it becomes their own, they believe in the Lord, when they become a new believer, they're going to be pretty strong. But if we're talking about someone who is saved out of Judaism or out of paganism, when they become a Christian, without having a foundation, they will be very weak. And so I think what Paul is saying is the weak, there's going to be some overlap with category, the category in 21, and some overlap with the category in 20. They have weaknesses in their faith because they're still growing, and he becomes like them, of course, to win them, but also even after they've won, he'll continue to meet them in their weakness in order that he may strengthen them. And then he kind of summarizes this whole statement up with this. I have become all things to all people so that by all possible means I might save some. And that all is a really awesome repetition. 3 uses of the word all. That's very intentional. All things to all people so that by all possible means I might save some. For us to save some, we're going to have to pull out all the stops. All things, all people, all possible means so that we might save some. Because we're going to only save some, a lot of people feel like not doing everything that they can do. And that's bad. We want to do everything we could possibly do just to save some. And Paul understood that better than most, but it wasn't a reason for him not to engage. It was a reason for him to engage. He says, I do all this for the sake of the gospel, that I may share in its blessings, which is the final piece of this. And we get back to a motivation here with this final verse. I do all this. All of this, we'll call it cultural gymnastics. This using your freedom to become like a chameleon and as much as you can adopt the practices of the people around you. He engages in the cultural gymnastics. Why? Well, as he's already said, to win those. And now he says here, for the sake of the gospel. The gospel drives him to do this. The gospel drives him to cultural gymnastics. One of the fruits of the gospel is that we don't demand our rights or demand our way. We engage in a bit of cultural gymnastics so that we might save some. It's a fruit of the gospel. That I may share in its blessings. This is a really interesting statement because in the Greek, this word isn't there. It literally says, so that I may share in it. It being, bloop, the gospel. So if blessings isn't there, and it is the only thing that's there, sharing in it is a reference, again, back to the gospel. So he says, I do all this for the sake of the gospel, that I may share in the gospel. And why is this so important? It's because Paul would say that if he's not becoming all things to all people so that he might save some, that he's not really come to share in the gospel. You see, those who share in the gospel will be transformed by the gospel. Paul says, if I'm not transformed by it, if I'm not doing this, do I really even share in it? You know, that's the reverse question that we could engineer from this final sentence. I think it's really significant because many of us don't live out the transformation that the gospel brings. We got to ask ourselves why. Because if we're living in the gospel, if we're doing all for the sake of the gospel, there's going to be some cultural gymnastics. There's going to be some fruit. There's going to be some evidence that we're trying to do everything we can to save some. And if we don't do that, the question is, have I even really come to share in the gospel?